All right. So, hello museum families, and welcome to our third RBCM at Home Kids, a play date through screens across British Columbia and the world. The first two sessions are recorded and you can find them on our Royal BC Museum YouTube page if you weren't able to join us for the first two weeks. So my name is Chris O'Connor and I'm a learning program developer here at the Royal BC Museum. The museum and my home is on Lekwungen territory, a beautiful place. And if I were to bike 8 minutes that way, I would get to the museum. If I were to bike 8 minutes that way, which is south, I get to Clover Point and Dallas Road, which is where there are wonderful tide pools with wild worlds within them. And that's what we'll be exploring today, tide pools. But first, take your hand like this, raise it over your hand and over your shoulder, and give yourself a little pat on the back. We are all doing a great job. It's hard to spend this much time inside our houses, but it's the way for all of us to be safe right now. So we're all really helping each other out through this. And I'm grateful to be able to get to hang out with you all during this period. So last week we were drawing insects and spiders and centipedes with our curator of entomology, Dr. Joel Gibson. And some of you sent in your drawings. So I wanted to just share some of those with you right now because they are so beautiful. So here are some of the drawings, just some of the drawings that we got. There are bees, dragonflies, centipedes. This centipede at the top here wants to hide under a rock. And so really beautiful use of colors. Really, it felt like you were really, families out there, you're really listening to Joel and understanding all the different kinds of diversity that there are in the insect and spider and centipede world. So thank you so much for sending those out. And we will, at the end of the session today, I'll let you know how you can send in what you're doing today. So in this format, you'll see me, and you'll also see, but you'll mostly see our special guest each week, and today that's Heidi. So do you want to wave, Heidi? So though we can't see you, we can hear from you if you use the chat window or the comments section if you're watching. Well, actually, you won't be watching on Facebook Live unless I can get it to work. So please ask questions as we go along, and heads up, we'll be drawing again today, so make sure you have at least a few pieces of paper, something to draw with, and some scissors for today for some light cutting. And we're recording this session, so if you need to take a break and you need some more time, you can always just play it again later. The most important thing is to be kind to yourself these days, so do things at your own pace. So let's meet our special guest today. Today's special guest is one of the nicest colleagues, smartest people at the museum, Heidi Gartner. She is the Royal BC Museum's collection manager of invertebrates, which means that she looks after and studies specimens and animals at the museum that do not have backbones. If you take your hand again and you put it around your back, you'll feel that there's bones that go up and down the middle of your back, and that's called your spine or your backbone. So we have those. We're vertebrates because we have a spine. So Heidi does not study us. She studies invertebrates, so things that don't have backbones, like crabs and mussels and squids and barnacles, things you might find in a tide pool. So hello, Heidi. Welcome, and we're so glad that you're here today. And I have one question for you, Heidi. I was thinking, if you could be, for one day, you could be one animal in the ocean and live the whole day as that one animal in the ocean, what would you be?
Oh, that's not a fair question because it's not an invertebrate.
Oh, yeah, you can
answer invertebrates, but I would love to be one of the fast-moving animals and just swim as far as I could go and explore everything that I could see, and preferably actually go down deep. So maybe one of the big whales, like a blue whale or something like that. I would all around. So
nice.
Maybe I could be a squid because squid can also do that. So that's my invertebrate answer. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah. So yeah, thanks for joining us today for drawing. My name's Heidi Gartner, and the things that we'll need today is probably 2 pieces of paper, because I'm going to draw, or we are going to draw together 5 different tide pool animals, and then we're going to cut them out and put them on a picture of a tide pool. So you'll need 2 pieces of paper, scissors, and whatever you'd like to draw with. So if you need a minute to get that, please feel free to. Chris acknowledged that our workplace is on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen speaking people. I'm also out in Saanich, so I'm in the traditional territories of the Sinchafan speaking nations as well. So thank you very much. And today we're going to talk about tide pools. And I live near the ocean. Maybe not all of our participants do. So just quickly, what are tide pools? So if you live near the ocean, you probably notice that every day the water level changes. It's not always at the same place on the shoreline. It actually moves in and out each day. And at the lowest point, that's called the low tide. And at the highest point, it reaches up the shore, that's called the high tide. And in between there, it's the intertidal zone. And that's a really fun place where people can explore animals that live in the ocean. It's a pretty extreme environment if you think about it. You're an animal that's usually covered in water, and suddenly you're exposed to air and sun and wind and all those fun things. So the animals that live there are actually really neat and have a lot of adaptations to living in this extreme place. What also happens is there can be tide pools. So not all beaches are perfectly straight and flat. There's often depressions, and that's what we're going to explore today. So those fun little pools that get created in this tidal zone where you can find animals in there. So hopefully everyone has the tools that they need. We are going to be drawing 5 different invertebrates. And I gave this little disclaimer a bit before, but I am not actually an artist. So if you're here for an actual artist lesson, sorry. More what I'm going to do is use drawing as a tool to teach you about some of these cool animals and what they do. So let's get started. The first animal we're going to draw, we're going to practice drawing. We're going to start warming up with something really, really easy. We're going to do something called a limpet. A limpet is an animal that basically, I want you to think about it as a soft triangle. So we're going to go up, down, and then instead of doing a straight line to go across, we're going to do kind of a curved one. Can you believe it or not? That is actually our first animal you've drawn. You've already drawn an animal. Whew, good work. So I just want to show you, this is a shell of an actual limpet. So they basically look like little hats. There's that triangle profile shape you saw. They have a pointy top, and then they form a circle. What usually happens in the circle, so if you're going to cut out your picture later, you don't need to draw this extra one, but I'm going to draw it for you just for fun in case. But you draw a circle, so this is what you'd be looking at if you turn that animal upside down and if this still had an animal in it. And limpets are closely related to snails, so they have this large muscular foot. This is what they crawl all over the intertidal with, and it's big and fleshy and like a really large muscle. And then they have a head here with 2 little antennae, and that they have. So just like that, that's what they look like underneath. And at the bottom of that little head area, there's a little circular area here, and that's where their mouth is. So what are limpets? They're basically snails. They're, instead of having a coiled shell, they have this little cap-like shell that I showed you here. And what they do is they actually take algae and diatoms and anything kind of living on the rocks, and they scrape it off with this really specialized tongue they have in that mouth. So their tongue is called a radula. And if we were to magically take out their tiny little tongue and put it under a microscope, I'm just going to show you again, you don't need this if you're going to put it on your drawing later, but their tongue is kind of these 2 parallel lines. And what you would see if you looked up close is almost like sharp teeth in series of rows. And what they do is they roll that tongue along the rocks, and they basically are licking off algae. It's pretty amazing. I'm going to show you a picture just in case you want to color yours in afterwards. I'm showing you pictures from this book. I think this might be backwards for you. I'm so sorry. It's called Marine Life of the Pacific Northwest. It's by Andy Lamb and Bernard Hamby. It's a great picture book if you're starting to get into exploring tide pools. And just in case you're going to color your limpet later, these are some images of the different limpets. So basically, they tend to be colored kind of like mottled rocks so that they blend in a bit more with their habitat. Now, this is usually because they are a bit more exposed to predators. Things that will eat them are pretty much like sea stars and shorebirds and all sorts of different animals like that. So when you're coloring them, think about more mottled and blending into their environment. So first animal, triangle. As long as you've done your curvy kind of triangle, you've done an awesome job so far. Thank you for joining us. Next up is we're going to do something called a mussel. Are we doing okay? Yeah? Good.
Yeah.
Next up, we're going to do mussels. So again, just remember on your one piece of paper that you should fit about 5 animals in it and that we're going to cut them out afterwards. So a mussel is what I'm going to call a pointy oval. That's the basic way I would tell you to start drawing it. So start up near the top and start kind of doing a very long oval, and then come back up and meet at a point at the top. And then draw a line straight down the middle of that. Yep, I told you I'm super artist. That is your second animal. That is a mussel. So mussels
Heidi, we just had the requested, if you can move your screen up a little bit. So if you can just.
Like that closer or this up?
Yeah, I think probably, that's probably good.
Okay. If I go much closer, I won't be able to fit my arm in. I apologize, everybody.
No, that's great.
Yeah. So a mussel is a bivalve. It's 2 shells that come together. And I have a really tiny one that I found on the beach that was empty. So this is what, oh, it's so small. It might not show up here. This is what the 2 valves look like when they're apart. So inside, there's an animal that's filter feeding food. So I'm actually going to draw a second one beside this one to show you what it would look like if it was underwater. So that first one's out of the water and closed up. This one we're going to do the same sort of thing, except for we're going to leave a little space, thinking that those 2 valves are slightly open. And what they do is they filter water, and they pull out all those tiny little microscopic bits that we can't see with our naked eye. And they've got these things called siphons. So they're big round holes, and this would draw water in. It would go through their internal anatomy and filter out these food particles, and then they'd shoot the water out this second hole. So the X-current siphon. These animals can stay placed in the intertidal zone with a special feature called byssal threads. So what they can do is they can excrete byssal material, and they actually put anchors down to the rocks. So if you want to draw a couple of just lines, they can even attach to each other and to the ground from kind of that midline. So those are mussels. Again, I'm not a super artist, but that is basically what they look like in real life. So what you would see if you were out in the intertidal is usually there's lots of them all together. There are 2 valves together. And this is what they look like when they open up and the animal's not inside them. So you might find those empty shells along the beach sometimes. So just to give you an idea of kind of what they look like when you see them in the person in the intertidal. All right, that was our second animal, 2 out of 5. This is where you're gonna really see what a cartoon drawer I am. Next up, we are gonna do urchins. Does anyone know what an urchin is off of the top of their head? I hope you all said spiky ball. That's what I say, spiky ball.
We had about 4 or 5 people raise their hands digitally. So.
Oh, perfect. Oh, I'm so proud of you guys. That's great. Urchins are one of the more fascinating animals for me. They're not something that you see right away or very commonly intertidal, but when you're doing tide pooling, this is an animal you're going to see a bit more. And especially if, Chris mentioned there's some great tide pooling around here at either Clover Point or Cattle Point. If you were to go to, say, Botanical Beach out in Port Renfrew, these have really neat tide pools there, and you see a lot of urchins in those ones. So spiky ball, you ready? Let's do it. So your ball should be just slightly squished up and down. So it's not a perfect circle, it's kind of a squished one. Oh, this is where it's going to be hard for me drawing up here, but does anyone can roughly see that? Great. We'll move this a bit closer. Urchins look like this in real life, if you wanted to see some pictures. And the ones that I'm going to have in my mind for the intertidal are these two. So that's why I've switched to purple, just to kind of give our tide pool a little bit more coloration and different thing. You can either do red or purple. And the other more common one here is the green urchin. So as you saw from those pictures, they are literally spiky balls. So start in the middle of your ball and just add some spikes. I'd say maybe start with 4 and then start radiating out. I make my spikes just kind of look like little triangles. And you just kind of want to radiate out, thinking that this animal lives in the intertidal. It's being covered up by the ocean sometimes, but it's also sometimes getting exposed. There's lots of things that want to eat it, and this is the way that it protects itself, is it has lots of spikes that kind of make it undesirable to eat. I don't think I'd want to pick up a really spiky ball to eat it. The funny thing is there are animals that eat urchins. One of the more well-known ones are sea otters. Sea otters love sea urchins. So that's my spiky ball. Beautiful, huh? Funny enough, it actually looks not too far off from the real thing in the sense of lots of spikes covering a ball. This animal is also an animal that likes to eat algae. So it will either scrape off the algae off of rocks or that sort of thing, or it can actually get algae stuck on its spikes and then pass it to its mouth. So how does it pass it to its mouth? Well, urchins are part of a group called the echinodermata. That's a fancy Latin word for saying spiky skin. Very obvious, spikes, great. And one of the features of the echinodermata is that they have a water vascular system. So how they move most of their appendages and how they circulate fluids in their body is this network of water through running through tubes. And what it looks like for how they're able to move and also how they're able to move food around their body is they have these things called tube feet. The tube feet are long tubes, and at the end there's kind of like these suction cups, if you want to think of just putting almost like a little U there. If you want to think of a suction cup or like a really mini plunger, and what they can do is they can move around on these and attach them and pick them up and move them, or they can use it to pass the food from their mouth or from their, that gets stuck on their spines, all the way down to their mouth. So if you're looking at an urchin and say this were the surface that it were walking on, its mouth is actually down on the bottom. That's how it does its scraping of the algae and that sort of thing. Or it then uses its tube feet to pass its food to it there. So most people it's counterintuitive. We're used to looking at things and thinking, oh, the mouth must be on the top or what we can see, but it's actually down against the surface where it's eating. So add some more tube feet if you can, long tubes with a little bit of a suction cup at the end. Good,
So
purple
Heidi,
stripe.
we have just a couple questions about sea urchins, and a
Sure.
lot of people have mentioned how they've held sea urchins, which is an interesting feeling. Someone had a question if you had stepped on a sea urchin, whether it would hurt. Another person
Yes.
had a question, do sea urchins eat seaweed? And then also, are there organs like humans?
So
Sorry, the three quick questions.
yeah. So urchin spines would hurt if you stepped on them, in the sense that they are sharp and pokey. They're not super sharp, so if you stepped on it maybe gently, it would not puncture your skin, but it would not feel great. We are very lucky in that all of our sea urchins that we have in BC do not have any venom in their spines. Some urchins around the world have venom in their spines, and that's why some people are so scared of them, because if you step on them in certain tropical areas, you can get like a venom in you that would be painful. So here, the only thing that really happens is that you can get like a rash if you cut your skin and it gets infected, that sort of thing. So that you can hold urchins, like someone said, if you have one placed gently on your hand, that won't hurt. Like the spikes aren't that razor sharp kind of thing. The other question, I believe, was, do they eat algae? Yes, they do. So they'll either scrape it off of the ground, they'll catch it on their spikes and pass it to their mouth. And one of the things about urchins is they're known about to eat a lot of kelp and kelp forests. And so when I told you one of the predators on urchins was sea otters. So when the sea otters weren't doing so well in BC, they actually were extirpated for a while, which means that we didn't have any sea otters living in BC. Kelp forests actually declined because sometimes the urchin populations got too big. So that's one of those like cascading effects of what can happen in ecosystems in the ocean. You know, everything's connected. And by losing our kelp forests are really important. They're similar to what you think of as forests on land. So other animals live in them. They're nursery grounds for a lot of fish, that sort of fun stuff. Did I get all those questions, Chris? You're muted, Chris.
At the end of the session, we'll have a period of time for questions. So I would say we can come back to some of those questions as well.
Okay. I'm just realizing that we're a little bit short on time. So I had originally said 5 animals. Right now I'm going to do 4, and then we'll cut them out and put them on our tide pool, if that sounds good. Mm-hmm. So my last animal I'm going to do is an anemone. It's also one of those weird ones because it's spelled anemone. So this is an animal that is, some people mistake it for like a plant. And it's also got its name from a flower. So if we're going to draw it, the first basic thing I'm going to ask for is, again, a flattened oval. So a horizontal flattened oval. This is their feeding disc. They are very water-like tubes. So if you can see that there, I've drawn kind of a column that the oval is sitting on. And this is the bottom of it. It's called the pedal disc, but basically they are long tubes that have in the middle of them the feeding area. So kind of like a circular mouth. We'll do this here. There's a mouth that's in there that goes into this big column here. And anemones have tentacles. Tentacles are for capturing prey. So these are images of some of the more common tide pool ones. We've got them there. And I've switched to green because I have in my mind these two when I'm thinking about tide pool anemones. But anemones are actually one of the more colorful types of animals in BC. Like if you started flipping through the pages of this book, you'd see a lot of like reds and pinks and kind of spotty or whites. So definitely feel free to play around with your colors of your anemones. But because I'm thinking about tide pools, I'm going to do this. And so this one's actually considered a predator because what it does is it has tentacles. I'm just going to draw mine really basic, kind of like flower petals. And these tentacles can grab basically any food item that passes by them. and try and grab them. And in the tentacles, they have these stinging cells called nematocysts. So if you were to touch an anemone tentacle, it sometimes feels like sticky. What you're actually touching, or what's actually happening when you touch the tentacle, is it's shooting out a little tiny structure, which is microscopic, that's basically like barbed into your skin. Kind of like something like that. Oh, it's shooting this out and it's connected to its main part. It doesn't hurt humans. Our skin's too thick, but if you can imagine you're a tiny little like shrimp or fish or that sort of thing, and you get stung by a lot of these and then you got caught up and you're pulled in, that's how they eat it. So
do they have a stomach?
So yeah, what happens with anemones, which is kind of gross but also cool, is they capture them with their tentacles, they pass them into their mouth. The inside of this column is basically a huge digestive system. It's just one big kind of empty processing center. And then what's cool is the exit, same way it went in. Ooh. So yeah, if you're gonna take time to do your anemone, I'd maybe add a second row of tentacles, because that's a lot of work that these animals got to do if they're taking down bigger things than them. So I kind of got 2 here. So
we have about five minutes, Heidi, just for the official session, and then we'll have time for questions. Okay,
so the 5th animal I was gonna do, I've actually drawn one beforehand. It's a little crab. So crabs, if you're gonna draw one on your own time, just remember those big pinchy claws and jointed legs, arthropods. I will maybe talk about it in my tide pool in case you guys are gonna do it on your own afterwards. So right now, what I'd like you to start doing is cutting out your shapes. When I say cutting out your shapes, don't worry about making it pretty. It's just literally to kind of get an outline of the animal so you can place it in a tide pool, because what I'm going to tell you about is where you would find each of these animals within a tide pool. So just even a rough outline.
And just a reminder, so the first one you did was a limpet. The first one that you did was a limpet.
Yeah.
And then the second one you did was a mussel. A mussel, and then a sea urchin.
Yeah. And then an
anemone.
Yeah. So let's draw a tide pool. So imagine the beach is sloping, it's coming down. You've got your gentle sloping. So it would look something like this. But what happens with tide pools is either natural or something happens that there's kind of a depression in the ground. And then the beach kind of gently keeps going. And so when that tide moves in and out, like we were discussing, water can get trapped in here and create kind of like a little mini sea world for animals. So even if the tide is out, these animals are in the water. So we're going to take the animals that we've cut out and just discuss where they live. So first up, I'm going to do the limpet, our fun little triangle. Do you remember that underneath I drew that really cool, big, round, muscular foot? So where do you think this animal would be in a tide pool? The neat thing is, it actually can survive up and out of the water for pretty good periods of time. So when it's covered in water, it's running around trying to find algae to scrape off. But when the water recedes, it can actually live pretty far. And what happens is it takes that big muscular foot that's underneath it, and it can rake it almost like, think about a plunger. So it sticks down the outsides of its foot, but it pulls up the middle, and it is like a plunger on the rock. It creates an incredible suction. And they actually, a lot of the species that we have around here have been found to have what they call home scars. So they'll actually have a place in the rock where they go back that is kind of been worn out more to fit their shell. And so they can do that thing where they pull on their foot. And that way, this, if you can imagine, it's out of the water, it's in the sun, that sort of thing. it basically pulls down its shell, has a little bit of mucus around the edge of its shell, and it can stay in there and it's still moist, and it can protect its body that way. Next up, let's take our mussel that we drew, and we'll think about where those would go. Mussels also are adapted to being outside of the water. So remember, they've got the valves. We drew them two different ways, one open, one closed. Let's put it right on the edge of the water here then. So the one that's under the water is still doing its filter feeding, but mussels are two valves that can close perfectly tight. So when you're at a beach, these are the type of animals that you'd see kind of up near the higher tide levels. And what they do is they have these two really strong muscles, like our muscles, inside of them that can keep those valves closed, and they won't dry out. They can tolerate, they have really thick shells actually for invertebrates, and they can stay really well protected and exposed for quite some time. Next up, I'm gonna do that sea urchin. Let's think about our big spiky ball. Where do you think you would find it? This one's actually tricky because even though it's got a hard outer body with the spikes on it, remember that water vascular system I was talking about with the little tube feet and how it works entirely on water and seawater moving around in their body? This animal has to stay moist. It cannot do very well when it's out of the water. So it would usually be found in tide pools, kind of near the bottom, in water, in submerged water, or it will be trying to find water. This is one of these animals that if it is out for too long, it will dry out and it will not survive. What's neat about them is urchins actually contribute to tide pools. So they can make tide pools bigger by helping to wear away different areas within tide pools with those spines. So if you go to Botanical Beach, you will see that there's little urchin divots. The last animal we have to put on is our anemone. It's a big tubey fleshy animal, so it prefers to be in the water, but it's one that can actually be, for the reason I drew the green one is I wanted to tell you a little bit of a cool story in that the tide pool anemones that we have on our coast, the two green species I showed you, they have adaptations to being exposed for some time. So most sea urchins need to be wet a lot of the time to, they have a very like moist, mucousy kind of surface. But these animals, they're green because they have symbiotic algae living in them. So what happens is when they're exposed at in the sunlight, there's actually an algae inside of them doing photosynthesis and giving them kind of the carbon and oxygen and all that stuff that we get from those animals. They also sometimes will protect their outer bodies with shells and that sort of fun stuff. So I think that we're out of time.
And then though, Heidi, I was gonna say maybe the crab that you made can be crawling between all of them.
Yeah, so crabs, unlike most of these, is a lot more motile. Where I was gonna put it was right here because the thing about crabs is they have a hard outer body. They don't have the mucousy soft parts that a lot of these other animals have. But they have a lot more motility. So you will find them under rocks or near water. But if they do not have a rock to hide under or a tide pool to occasionally go from, crabs will actually dry out pretty quickly. And what's neat is where their legs attach to their body, they have gills. So their lungs that they breathe with, and those have to stay moist. If those dry out, then the animal does bad. So it will usually be found under rocks, scurrying around, and it can make the journeys out of water and move around, but it can't be just out in the sun for too long. Nice. So it was going to be kind of more like here.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Heidi.
Yeah.
Well, I want to show something just quickly before we officially end, but then we'll stick around a little bit if people, if you have questions. We have some questions already, but I want to share my screen again, just to say that, so that's the art from last week. We would love to see your tide pool doodles, your tide pool art from this week. So feel free to share it with me COCONNOR at royalbcmuseum.bc.ca. And if you share it, then we'll share it next week. Or you can share it through our social media channels at Royal BC Museum or hashtag RBCM Kids. Keep exploring. We have on our learning portal, we have pathways and playlists all about invertebrates in the ocean. There are 2 pathways that are specifically created with Heidi. One I have there called glass sponges that just came up. So you can Google Royal BC Museum Learning Portal, and there's lots of really cool information on that website. And then also next week, we're gonna stay in the water and we're gonna go fish with Dr. Gavin Henke, he's our curator of vertebrate zoology, where Heidi is the collection manager of invertebrates. So they're both interested in water, but just slightly different animals that spend time in water. And this is also Gavin too. So if you're a fan of Star Wars, then you might want to come next week too. So with that being said, I just want to thank you so much, Heidi. I feel like oh, is there a rock there too? Nice. I just wanted to thank you so much for sharing just the interesting, diverse world of a tide pool and all the crazy creatures that live within it. Out there, if you're interested, every Tuesday and Thursday we have these Royal BC Museum at Home sessions, more geared toward adults and maybe older youth. Those are at 12 o'clock, both Tuesday and Thursday. And then every other week on Wednesdays, we have a RBCM outside. So Heidi was saying earlier that she's going to do one of those in a few weeks. We're really looking forward to continuing to explore with you in the weeks and months ahead. This recording, if anyone out there had friends that wanted to see on Facebook Live, just know that we have this recorded and we'll put it on our YouTube page later so they can see and be able to see it through recording. That is the official end of our session today, Tide Pool Doodles. I'm going to stay on, so thank you so much for joining. We'll stay on for maybe 5 or 10 more minutes just to answer some questions, but if you need to leave, please do that as well. And if you want to stick on for some questions and answers, then please do that as well. Okay, thanks everyone.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, Heidi.
Bye. Thanks, Chris.
We had actually a question early on and a question toward the end. The question early on was how are clam shells made? And then the later question was how are mussel shells made? I'm assuming that would be similar.
Same sort of idea, yeah. That gets into a really complicated question, but they produce their own shells, which is pretty amazing. They have a structure called a mantle, and a mantle can secrete the different minerals and things that they need to make their shells. So it's a complex process, but there is an organ that does it. And usually what happens, if anyone's curious, is when they're babies, they have a little shell like this, for example, for the mussel. And then as they grow, the mantle is at the edge of their body, and they're usually adding almost like rings of a tree. So they're usually kind of growing out in concentric ways. So they never have to kind of regrow this. They add out in different layers. So if you want to know more about that, I recommend biology classes, and we'll tackle it another day. But look up the mantle if you want to know. And for example, snails and clams and mussels and chitons, they're all part of the same group called the mollusca, and they just produce their shells out of different levels of things. So for example, snail shells, you know how they're kind of white often, or bivalve shells like the clams, those are more calcium carbonate than what's in mussels that are more black and that sort of thing. And then, yes, complicated answer, how they build up the shell. There's something called a periostracum. Yeah. that changes the kind of color of the shell and can get worn away. So thank you. Very good question, but you might have
a lifetime of learning.
Yeah, yeah.
We had a question earlier on about urchins and are their internal organs similar to humans in any way?
In some ways, yeah. But again, adapted to their lifestyle. So one of the neat things about urchins is they're processing a lot of what I would call like fibrous material. Like vegetarians tend to produce more fiber because they're eating a lot of algae. And so if you were to look inside of an urchin, their mouth's down here and their butts up here, they have this specialized feeding structure called an Aristotle's lantern that is nothing like a human mouth, other than that's where it's got teeth and that's where the food comes in. But their digestive system is super long and it coils around a lot of their bodies to be able to process all of that material. And then they have gonads, so, you know, eggs and sperm that are usually along the edges of their test, the inside of them. So we also produce eggs and sperm, so that would be similar. But then a lot of the ways that the water vascular system works is it's along the edges of the test, and that's like nothing that we have, except for it could maybe be compared to our circulatory system, like our blood. So how it moves is part of it, but the other part is how it exchanges and moves all the things that your body needs. So yeah, the thing about invertebrates is they're actually quite complex with lots of very neat adaptations in each group. Thank you for that.
So we have one more, well, we have lots of questions, but so one final question and then one request. So the question is about reproduction. So with urchins and with mussels, how do they reproduce, and what would a mussel baby look like?
Oh, great. So, I love talking about invertebrate reproduction. So I could go on about it in all sorts of different ways. But the thing you got to think about is that they live in the ocean, and so they're in a very different medium than us. They're in the water a lot of the times. And they also vary in how close they are and how complex their brains are. So things like urchins and actually mussels, they do something called broadcast spawning. So they don't even have to touch each other to reproduce. They just send their little baby gametes out into the water, and there's usually some sort of cues like temperature, water, food. There's cues to the animals so that everyone's kind of throwing their gametes out into the ocean at the same time. Their babies hopefully mix, and then they swim around in the plankton for a long time before they settle. So reproduction is really cool. What can also happen in invertebrates, like for example, limpets are really neat because they start out their life as male and then turn into female. So again, different strategies for different animals. Most of these animals that I drew today, I do that kind of broadcast spawning. The only ones that actually mate are the crabs. One more cool thing though is anemones. Anemones can literally clone themselves, some species. So they can rip off parts of their bodies. The more common tide pool one can actually split into two. And so theoretically they can live forever, which is incredible. Oh, and one more thing, I'm sorry, I have a captive audience, but urchins, recent research found out that I drew the purple urchin, but you know how I told you the red urchin could also be drawn? Most urchins were thought up until relatively recently to only grow to be about 30 years old. And new research, particularly in BC, has revealed that the red urchins can grow to 200 years old, they think. And that the largest ones that we see are actually that old. So, yeah. Thank you so much for all your questions, everybody. I hope that those suffice.
So last request is, and so we still have 45 families still on, which is great. Thanks for sticking around. You don't need to, but you're welcome to. But we had a request from, I think it was Kara, because you didn't have a chance to draw the crab, if you wouldn't mind just quickly showing us just a quick way of drawing a crab.
Okay, so crabs. The ones that I have in mind are these shore crabs. These are the ones that you're most likely to see at the high tides, that sort of thing. They run around, and you can find, if you flip rocks, even not at tide pools like on beaches, again, just do it carefully, but and putting animals back when you can. So that's the one that I have in mind, and there's two different ways you can draw those crabs. What I would recommend for that species is starting off with, let's do the really cartoon way first. A soft red square, so kind of rounded edges and up. The eyes are kind of off to the side here. And then crabs have the big pincher claws. So if I was going to do the cartoon way, I would do up like this and two big circles with some pinchies. Crabs are known as decapods. They're part of a group called decapods, and deca corresponds to 10. And so after you draw the claws, you need to draw 8 other legs. And arthropods, the phylum they're part of, is jointed legs. So I would draw some kind of legs with a bit of, what would you call that, bends in them. So you'd need another 4 legs on each side. And keep going down. If you're going to draw this a little more anatomically correct, like if you have time today, when you're drawing each of these jointed legs, do a longer triangle for the base one, 2 smaller segments. You can decide how you want to do them. You might have to kind of angle them a bit to get the legs to go which way you want. And then a pointy, think about them needing kind of like a pointy edge to crawl along. So again, if I was going to do this one, something like this, and then pointy bit and long triangle, 2 shorter, and a pointy one. And the claws would be, a good way to do claws is to do a triangle with the outer side kind of a little bit longer. And then what I think it's a trapezoid. And then you need the big round pinchers up there. So rough crab.
So Heidi, Keeley says that your crab is super good, and I agree.
Thank you.
And then the last question is one of our participants was saying that they saw a crab out in the sun for a really long time, yeah. And they wondered how that was possible.
And do they know if it lived?
That's a good question.
Most crabs, if they're out in the sun, you will find them in a little depression of sand. They are trying to save themselves. They have to stay moist because right up where their legs meet their carapace, the main part of their body, there's kind of a thinner membrane, and then it attaches to their lungs. And their lungs are almost like, if you imagine feathers, but on the inside. But they have to stay wet. They have to stay wet to be able to exchange the gases. And so if a crab finds itself out in the sun, it will try and hunker down. So you'll find them all closed up. You know, their pinchers aren't out. They're not trying to fight. They usually try and get a depression in the sand, and they're trying to keep those moist until they're covered again. They can usually do this pretty well under rocks for some species, again, as long as they're not out in the blazing sun. If you saw something out in the sun just on a rock, and it was out for a long time, I have a feeling it didn't move again after. Sorry.
Well, apparently it did live.
Okay.
But yeah, so yeah, that's nice.
Certain species are better adapted at it than others. So for example, where that membrane meets is a bit thicker, but not a lot of crabs can do it.
So if you're still here, thank you for sticking around. Our colleague Liz just sent a link to a learning portal pathway around crabs and crab drawings that Josephine Hart did that are quite beautiful.
Incredible. 10 times no, 100 times more beautiful than mine. She's actually an artist and one of the world experts, or definitely BC's expert on crabs, and an incredible woman to have done that research, mostly from her basement of her house. So definitely feel free to look it up.
Yeah. Oh, not true, Heidi. We love your drawings.
Thanks, colleagues. I work in a very supportive institution.
But Learning Portal, if you go to the Learning Portal and you look for crabs, there's a pathway on the sketching. So thank you so much, Heidi. I could listen to you for hours. So I learned something every time I listen to you speak about the ocean. So thank you, and thanks everyone for sticking around, and we'll see you next week at 11. So,
Chris, may I just ask something?
Yes, please.
There's a bunch of things that aren't in the chat box, but are in what's called the Q&A.
Yeah.
Is there any way that I can respond to those without logging out? Like, can we email them, or do I have to do them through here? Because I don't see how I can answer them if I log out.
Yeah, so I can, there's a few, like, what is the smallest animal in the ocean?
Okay. There's microscopic plankton that are like less than millimeters, that are kind of the babies of things, or even their adults don't get that big. And they're usually what a lot of animals eat kind of at the surface of the ocean. So yeah, like less than a millimeter is the smallest.
And then how are tide pools, how are they actually formed?
Usually they can be anything from just, you know, if you look at a rocky shore, just the natural depressions that happen. But if they're in something that's called more like sandstone, or those softer rocks, they can build up due to rocks and urchins and different things getting swirled around by the tide. So they'll actually make them bigger. So for example, at Botanical Beach, that's how some of the tide pools are formed. They're really smooth and they're really round. But I classify tide pools as anything where you got a little bit of water. So just natural rock habitat kind of thing. And
then the last one that I just reading through, the last one is, how do otters eat sea urchins if they're so spiky?
Ah, that's a good one. So if you think about an urchin test with all those spikes, when you touch something like that, you're kind of getting your pressure distributed across many spikes. You're not getting just one spike in your hand, you're distributing it across, so it's less likely to puncture. So what happens is that can happen with sea otters, and they've got their tough little paws. And then how they actually break them open is, sea otters are known to carry around rocks for feeding. And what they do is they usually have a flat one they can put on their belly. They put whatever animal they want to eat, in this case an urchin, and they'll smash another rock on top, and then it opens up. And what they really love to eat in urchins is the gonads I was talking to you about. And this is actually a delicacy in some cultures. For example, on Japanese food, sometimes the roe or unami or whatever is the urchin gonads, because they're super dense, rich food. So that's what the otters like to eat as well. Sorry, I can keep talking.
Yeah. So that brings to end the session. We'll have you on again.
Your questions, and yeah, thanks a lot, Chris.
We'd love to have you on again, Heidi, later, just to come back and do another activity around invertebrates and oceans, and so.
I'll practice my drawing before.
Those were great drawings. All right.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.